October 25th, 1944. 6:45 in the morning. Off the eastern coast of Samar Island, the Philippine Sea lay strangely calm. Low clouds hung over the water like a ceiling of dull silver. The sun was only beginning to lift itself above the horizon, smearing pale orange light across long swells that rolled in from the Pacific. For the men aboard the small American escort carriers of Task Unit 7, 7.4.3, better known as Taffy 3, it looked like another routine day of war. They were not hunting battleships. They were hunting submarines. Taffy 3 consisted of 6 escort carriers: Fanshawe Bay, Gambier Bay, Kalinin Bay, Kitkun Bay, White Plains, and St. Lo Slow, box-shaped ships converted from merchant hulls and designed to provide air cover for the invasion of Leyte. Around them steamed 3 fleet destroyers, USS Johnston, USS Howell, and USS Heermann, and 4 smaller destroyer escorts, Samuel B. Roberts, Raymond, Dennis, and John C. Butler. Their mission that morning was simple: patrol the waters east of Leyte, launch anti-submarine sweeps, and fly close air support missions for American troops fighting inland. None of their pilots were armed for surface combat. Their aircraft carried depth charges, smoke bombs, rockets, and machine gun ammunition weapons meant for submarines and beach targets, not for armored warships. On the bridge of the flagship USS Fanshawe Bay, Rear Admiral Clifton A.F. Sprague was reviewing overnight reports when a lookout's voice cracked through the morning calm. Ships on the horizon bearing 015. Sprague lifted his binoculars and turned toward the northeast. At first, he saw nothing but haze. Then tall shapes began to separate themselves from the mist. Pagoda-style masts, high superstructures, multiple gun turrets. They were too big to be cruisers. Sprague stiffened. Battleships. Moments later, the first enormous waterspouts erupted near the carriers as shells landed short, throwing columns of seawater hundreds of feet into the air. Someone on the bridge said it quietly, as if volume itself might make it worse. "They're firing at us." Sprague did not need the confirmation. He was already doing the math in his head: speed, armor, gun caliber. His carriers could barely make 18 knots. The Japanese ships closing from the north could do more than 30. If they stayed on course, they would be annihilated. The ships charging toward Taffy 3 belonged to Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, the most powerful surface fleet Japan could still assemble in October 1944. Kurita had slipped through the San Bernardino Strait during the night after surviving heavy American air attacks in the Philippine Sea the day before. His force was battered but intact, and it included giants: the super battleship Yamato with her 18-inch guns, Nagato, and the fast battleships Kongo and Haruna, supported by heavy cruisers such as Chokai, Chikuma, and Kumano, plus destroyers screening the formation. Kurita believed he was about to strike the heart of the American invasion fleet at Leyte. When his lookouts spotted the American ships at dawn, they reported carriers' flat-deck silhouettes running south through scattered rain squalls. To Japanese eyes, that meant fleet carriers, the prize Japan had been hunting for years. Kurita ordered his ships to increase speed. What he did not know was that the carriers ahead of him were not the fast armored giants of Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet. They were the smallest carriers in the U.S. Navy. By the autumn of 1944, the Pacific War had reached a decisive phase. American forces had smashed through the Mariana Islands. Long-range bombers were now striking Japan itself. In October, General Douglas MacArthur had returned to the Philippines, landing tens of thousands of troops on Leyte in the largest amphibious operation yet attempted in the Pacific. Japan's high command responded with a desperate counterstroke Operation Shogo, a plan that scattered what remained of the Imperial Navy into multiple forces designed to converge on Leyte Gulf and destroy the vulnerable invasion. Shipping. Kurita's center force was meant to be the hammer. Other Japanese squadrons attacked from the south through Surigao Strait. A decoy carrier group under Admiral Ozawa lured Admiral William Halsey north. If everything worked, the American transports at Leyte would be caught in the middle. But naval plans rarely survive contact with weather, fuel shortages, and radio confusion. And now, in the gray dawn off Samar, two fleets that were never supposed to meet were rushing toward each other at closing speed. Taffy 3's ships were built for a different kind of war. Escort carriers displaced less than half the tonnage of fleet carriers. Their flight decks were narrow. Their hulls had no real armor protection. A single battleship shell could punch through from bow to stern. Their anti-aircraft batteries were respectable against planes' 40mm and 20mm guns crowded the decks, but useless against 16 or 18-inch shells. They carried no heavy guns. They carried no torpedoes. They carried no illusions about surviving a surface engagement. Sprague knew that instantly. He ordered his task group to turn south and began transmitting frantic contact reports to 7th Fleet headquarters. At the same time, he issued the only orders that made sense. All ships make smoke. Launch all aircraft immediately. Flight decks erupted into motion. Deck crews dragged planes forward while pilots sprinted across planks slick with morning dew. Engines coughed, then roared. Some aircraft were still being armed when Japanese shells splashed closer, forcing handlers to shove them into the air with whatever ordnance happened to be loaded. One pilot later recalled asking what weapons he should take. The answer from the deck officer, "Anything you've got." Behind them, Kurita's gunners were settling into their work. Range estimates were fed into fire control tables. Turrets rotated. Barrels elevated. On Yamato, the largest naval rifles ever mounted at sea began hurling shells that weighed more than a compact automobile. They landed among the escort carriers with terrifying accuracy. Near misses slapped hulls with sheets of water. Fragments rattled across flight decks. Antennas snapped. Signal flags vanished in spray. On white plains, sailors ducked as a shell passed so close that shrapnel shredded rigging and showered the bridge with steel splinters. The Japanese were still outside perfect range, but they were closing fast. From the outer edge of the formation, 3 American destroyers began racing north. USS Johnston, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Ernest E. Evans, swung out first. A Cherokee officer from Oklahoma, Evans was known for aggressiveness bordering on recklessness, the kind of captain who believed hesitation was more dangerous than gunfire. Beside him turned Hull and Heerman, laying thick chemical smoke behind them. The idea was brutally simple: blind the Japanese. Hide the carriers. Buy minutes. Minutes were life. Sprague watched the smoke curtain grow on his bridge screens while new splashes erupted just outside it. Through binoculars, he could see Johnston accelerating 30 knots, then more angling not away from the Japanese fleet, but toward it. Evans had already made his decision. If the carriers were to escape, someone had to slow the pursuers, and that meant torpedoes. Johnston cut through the haze. Her bow, lifting as engines drove her toward the cruiser line ahead. In her mounts, torpedo crews swung tubes to port. Gun captains trained 5-inch rifles on shapes they could barely see. Across the water, Japanese cruisers loomed larger by the second. Sprague stared at the tiny destroyer charging into a wall of steel and fire. The range was collapsing. The torpedo doors were opening, and the first real clash of the Battle off Samar was about to begin. The first American ship to break completely free of the smoke was USS Johnston. She emerged from the white-gray cloud at more than 30 knots, bow rising and falling as she sliced through long Pacific swells. Spray sheeted across her forecastle. Ahead, silhouettes of Japanese cruisers grew larger and sharper tall masts, layered bridges, multiple turrets tracking south. Lieutenant Commander Ernest Evans stood on Johnston's bridge wearing his life jacket and helmet, gripping the railing with one hand and his microphone with the other. Shell splashes bracketed his ship, walking closer with every ranging shot. He did not slow. At 0716 hours, Johnston's torpedo officer called out the firing solution. 10 Mark 15 torpedoes slid into the sea. White wakes streaked northward. Seconds stretched. Then 3 massive detonations erupted along the bow of the heavy cruiser Kumano. Steel plates folded inward. A turret vanished behind a wall of spray and smoke. Kumano sheared violently out of formation, her forward compartments flooding, speed collapsing. The Japanese cruiser line scattered. Captains swung rudders hard over to avoid incoming torpedoes. Columns compressed. Destroyers broke station. Gunnery solutions vanished. Evans turned Johnston sharply away, ordering full rudder and flank speed, then opened fire with every 5-inch gun aboard, against cruisers 10 times his size. At ranges so short Japanese gun crews could see muzzle flashes. Johnston's run was the signal. From the smoke behind her came USS Howell and USS Heermann. Howell drove straight into the cruiser screen, launching torpedoes at near-suicidal range. Heermann angled toward the Japanese battleships themselves, closing to fire on ships whose main batteries dwarfed her hull. Even farther south, a ship never meant for this kind of work made her turn. Destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts accelerated from the carrier screen. She displaced barely 1,400 tons smaller than some Japanese cruisers' secondary gun turrets. Her skipper, Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, did not hesitate. Roberts pushed her boilers beyond design limits, hitting nearly 28 knots. She was heading into the center of the fight. Japanese shells began finding Johnston. 8-inch rounds punched into her hull. One tore through her forward gun mount. Another smashed into the engine room, bursting steam pipes and killing sailors instantly. Still, she fired. Her gunners scored hits on Kumano's superstructure and secondary batteries, adding confusion to a ship already crippled by torpedoes. Howell was not so lucky. Charging battleships at close range meant sailing into the overlapping fire of dozens of heavy guns. She launched her torpedoes, forcing battleships to turn aside, but moments later she was hammered by shells that ripped through her thin skin. Fires bloomed along her deck. Speed bled away. Heermann, meanwhile, threaded through the chaos and loosed torpedoes toward the towering silhouette of Yamato. The Japanese flagship was forced to swing hard to starboard, temporarily removed from the chase while her escorts scrambled to protect her. The American destroyers were not sinking battleships. They were doing something almost as important. They were wrecking Kurita's formation. Above the surface fight, the first American aircraft were arriving. They came in waves from the escort carriers, Wildcats, Avengers, Helldivers, diving out of broken clouds, strafing bridges, dropping smoke floats, making torpedo runs even when they had nothing heavier than machine gun ammunition aboard. Some pilots attacked with rockets. Others had only depth charges, meant for submarines. They dropped them anyway. Near misses still forced evasive maneuvers. Smoke markers bloomed around Japanese ships. Machine gun fire raked decks and rangefinders. To Kurita's lookouts, it felt like carrier air groups were everywhere. Messages began pouring into Japanese flagships. Enemy carriers launching continuously. Cruisers under air attack. Torpedoes in the water. Visibility collapsed inside American smoke curtains while squalls rolled across the sea. What Kurita could see was chaos. What he could not see was the full picture. At about 0800 hours, Samuel B. Roberts burst through the smoke and opened fire with her 2 5-inch guns. She targeted the heavy cruiser Chokai. Her shells struck near the cruiser's bridge, killing officers and wrecking fire control stations. Chokai slowed, drifting out of formation. Roberts closed to less than 5,000 yards suicide range against 8-inch guns and kept firing. Japanese shells finally answered. A salvo smashed into Roberts' engine spaces. Boilers ruptured. Steam flooded compartments. Men died instantly. The little destroyer escort shuddered to a halt. Her guns did not stop. On the bridge of Yamato, Vice Admiral Kurita watched smoke swallow the horizon and aircraft dive through cloud gaps. His force had already been mauled in the Philippine Sea the previous day. One battleship had been sunk. Fuel was tight. Ammunition was precious. Now cruisers were reporting torpedo hits. Destroyers were scattered. Air attacks were coming from multiple directions. Kurita could not see the American carriers. He could only see destroyers charging and aircraft swarming. To him, it looked like the outer screen of a much larger task force. Radio reports from subordinate captains made the picture worse. Large carrier group ahead. Cruiser heavily damaged. Enemy destroyers attacking in waves. Kurita ordered his ships to regroup and reform. In doing so, he unintentionally gave Taffy 3 exactly what it needed. Time. Johnston reappeared from the smoke, battered but alive. Her speed was down. Steering was damaged. Evans had been wounded by shrapnel, his face burned and bleeding. He refused medical treatment. From the bridge wing, he kept pointing out targets, directing gunfire as more shells smashed into his ship. A heavy cruiser closed to finish her. Johnston fired star shells to blind enemy gunners and kept shooting until ammunition lockers were nearly empty. At last, Japanese fire crippled her engines completely. Dead in the water, smoke pouring from shattered decks, Johnston drifted as larger ships circled. Still, she had done her job. The carriers were farther south. The Japanese formation was broken. By late morning, the sea north of Taffy 3 was a maze of smoke clouds, oil slicks, burning destroyers, and circling aircraft. Kurita's captains were struggling to determine which targets mattered most. Battleships fired at destroyers. Cruisers chased carriers, only to lose them in smoke. Destroyers maneuvered wildly to avoid torpedoes that might or might not exist. Kurita faced a decision: push south and risk sailing into what might be Halsey's main fleet, or pull back, regroup, and avoid annihilation. He did not yet know that 2 American destroyers were sinking. He did not know that the carriers ahead of him were barely armed. What he knew was this: his formation was disordered. His cruisers were damaged. Air attacks were constant. And time was slipping away. To the south, Taffy 3's carriers continued to flee, trailing smoke like wounded animals. To the north, American destroyers burned. In the middle of it all, Kurita slowed his advance. And that hesitation, measured in minutes, would decide the battle. By mid-morning, the sea north of Taffy 3 had turned into a graveyard. Smoke hung low over the water in ragged curtains. Oil slicks shimmered in the sun. Wreckage drifted past in slow circles, splintered planks, life jackets, floating ammunition boxes. In scattered patches, Japanese cruisers and American destroyers still traded gunfire, but the furious cohesion of Kurita's charge had dissolved into a series of disconnected fights. For the Americans, the cost had already been terrible. For the Japanese, the situation had become incomprehensible. USS Johnston lay motionless in the water, her hull torn open in multiple places, her decks blackened by fire. Japanese cruisers closed cautiously, firing deliberate broadsides into the stricken destroyer. On Johnston's bridge, Lieutenant Commander Ernest Evans was still directing fire. He had been wounded repeatedly, shrapnel in his torso, burns on his face and hands, yet refused to leave his post. When his ship could no longer maneuver, He ordered her remaining guns to keep firing until ammunition was gone. Shortly before 10 o'clock, a final salvo ripped through Johnston's midsection. She rolled slowly to starboard. Evans gave the order to abandon ship. Minutes later, the destroyer slipped beneath the surface. Of Johnston's crew, fewer than half survived. Evans went down with his ship. For his actions that morning, he would later be awarded the Medal of Honor. Nearby, USS Hull was in even worse shape. After her torpedo run against the battleships, she had taken multiple heavy-caliber hits that smashed her boilers and knocked out steering. She drifted helplessly, while Japanese ships concentrated their fire. One shell detonated her forward magazine. Hull sank within minutes, leaving survivors clinging to debris as Japanese ships thundered past without stopping. Farther south, the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts fought to the end. Her boilers were destroyed. Her decks were riddled with holes. Her two 5-inch guns continued firing until their barrels glowed red from heat. When ammunition finally ran out, her crew prepared to abandon ship. She slipped under the waves around 0951 hours. She had lasted barely an hour in a battle she was never meant to enter. Above the wreckage, American aircraft kept coming. Pilots with empty racks made repeated attack runs, diving low over Japanese bridges to force gunners to duck. Others dropped smoke floats to thicken the curtain hiding the retreating carriers. Fighters strafed exposed decks and open gun mounts. Japanese ships fired constantly at planes that refused to go away, draining ammunition and exhausting gun crews. To Kurita, the air attacks never seemed to stop. To the Americans, they were desperation. But desperation looked exactly like dominance when viewed through smoke and broken radio circuits. Shortly after 0920 hours, Vice Admiral Kurita issued the order that stunned both fleets. He directed his ships to disengage and withdraw to the north. Battleships reversed course. Cruisers fell back behind smoke and squalls. Destroyers formed rearguards. The most powerful surface force Japan had assembled since the beginning of the war began to retreat from 6 escort carriers. Kurita believed he was facing the edge of a far larger American carrier force. He feared submarine ambushes. He feared renewed air attack from fleet carriers just over the horizon. He feared losing the remainder of his heavy ships in a battle that was no longer going according to plan. What he did not know was that Taffy 3 had almost nothing left. Some carriers were nearly out of aircraft. Several had been hit by cruiser fire. One Gambier Bay would soon be overwhelmed and sunk by gunfire during the final stages of the withdrawal. Others were limping south at top speed. Kurita's decision spared the invasion fleet at Leyte. It also ensured that Japan would never again mount a major surface offensive. When the smoke cleared, the numbers bordered on unbelievable. Taffy 3 had lost. Destroyers Johnston and Hull. Destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts. Escort carrier Gambier Bay. Hundreds of American sailors were dead. On the Japanese side, no battleships were sunk, but several heavy cruisers, including Chokai, Chikuma, and the crippled Kumano, were effectively knocked out of the battle and later destroyed by air attack or scuttled. Most importantly, Kurita had failed. He never reached the American transports. Leyte's beaches remained intact. The invasion held. Historians have argued about Kurita's withdrawal for decades. Some point to exaggerated reports from his captains, others to exhaustion, fuel shortages, and fear of American submarines. But the tactical reasons were clear. Smoke screens blinded Japanese optics. Continuous air harassment created the illusion of overwhelming carrier strength. Torpedo attacks shattered formation discipline. Destroyers forced battleships to maneuver instead of pursue. Time, the most precious commodity at sea, slipped away. Taffy 3 did not defeat Kurita by sinking his battleships. They defeated him by convincing him he was already losing. Admiral Chester Nimitz later called Samar one of the most courageous actions in U.S. naval history. Survivors remembered it less poetically. They remembered heat from gun barrels, the shriek of shells passing overhead, the smell of burning paint, friends disappearing into water streaked with oil. In 90 minutes, sailors in ships designed for convoy, escort, and submarine hunting had stopped a fleet built for decisive battle. The battle off Samar was not supposed to happen. That is why it mattered. It was the moment when improvisation beat planning, when smoke beat armor, when speed and audacity confused steel giants. In the vast chronicle of Leyte Gulf radar ambushes in the night, carrier duels to the north, submarine attacks in open seas, Samar stood apart, not for technology, not for numbers, but for the raw, calculated gamble of small ships that charged anyway. When the last aircraft landed back aboard their carriers that afternoon, pilots shut down engines on decks pocked by shrapnel. Sailors stared north at empty water where battleships had been. The ocean was quiet again, but every man there knew the truth. They had just survived a fight no one had planned, and in doing so, they had saved an invasion and changed the course of the Pacific War.